Welcome to this week's episode of the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dillon. Thank you very much for dropping in today. If you are enjoying the podcast and want to show your support, a 5-star rating on the iTunes podcasting app is always greatly appreciated, or just share the content. I know many of you have actually messaged me within the last week or so saying you're going to be sharing the content on Facebook groups with your friends and family. That is awesome. I'm super excited. So if you want to share the content, I would really appreciate it. It's one way to get new ears on the podcast. Thank you very much to our sponsor, CustomReptileHabitats.com. There is an affiliate link in both the show notes as well as the YouTube description, so you can go check out their website. And if you do purchase something, a small commission does come back to me to help support the show. Let's jump into the episode. Today I'm speaking with Dillon Damuth. He is the founder of Gecko Labs as well as one of the founding partners in Urban Ark Conservation. So Dillon and I have very similar philosophies when it comes to the reptile trade. Of course, conservation being a big key as well as higher quality of care, but it makes it even more interesting because Dillon's working on these really unique breeding projects. So we discuss the economics of breeding. Can you actually include higher level of care inside a breeding project? We discuss that. And we discuss conservation. What are some ways that you and I can actually help conservation? One of the issues in the reptile industry is a lot of us assume that keeping the animals in captivity is good for conservation, and Dillon kind of pokes some holes in that theories and gives us some better tools to use if you and I actually want to help the wild counterparts to the animals that we have in our homes. Dillon does have a very unique collection of animals, really interesting species of Abronia, a few really crazy lizards that I've never even heard of before from Sri Lanka. And if you are listening to the podcast on the Apple or Spotify or whatever, after you listen to this, you have to come to the YouTube version so you can watch the last 10 minutes or so, because in that last 10 minutes, Dillon brings a bunch of his animals and shows the lizards, and it's really cool. And I was really totally surprised. I wasn't expecting him to do that. So if you are listening, you'll get through the 90% of this no problem, but the last 10 minutes, definitely come watch the YouTube version so you can actually see those animals. Anyway, let's jump right into the conversation. I hope you enjoy. Well, Dillon, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Our mutual friend, Roy, who was on episode number 33, gave me your name, and I started looking into your website and everything, and I think we have very similar philosophies, and which is interesting because you're doing a breeding side to the reptile trade, so I really want to get into that and how your philosophy works with your breeding operation. But before we do that, how did your reptile journey start? What's your history with reptiles?
So, like most of us that are in the hobby, I started off as a young kid that just was finding stuff out in the backyard. So I grew up in the middle of nowhere in New York, and we actually had a huge backyard with a lot of it wooded, and we had dug out a pond, so we had turtles coming by, a lot of newts laying eggs and stuff in the pond. But yeah, like I was always out gallivanting around catching something. My first actual like breeding experience was a pair of garter snakes that I had caught. And then once they had the babies, I released them out into the backyard. But yeah, it's just from there, I've always had a pet reptile basically.
So you actually got two wild caught garter snakes to breed?
Yep.
Wow, that's pretty impressive for in those early days.
Yeah, I think I was 7 at the time.
Oh my gosh.
But it was basically like I had, I think it was a 40-gallon size aquarium that I set up outside for them in a shaded area. But basically where I found them, I basically just mimicked that in the enclosure, fed them and caught them locked up one day. My little mind didn't really know what they were doing, but my mom was like, they're wrestling. And I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah. And then you had a bunch of babies.
Yep. A couple months later, a bunch of little noodles.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
So, and then you started keeping reptiles like legitimately rather than wild caught. What were some of the first animals that you got into?
The first one that I got was leopard gecko. That was, I think, my 13th or 14th birthday. I'd gotten it as a gift, and then within the next 2 or 3 months, that evolved into 3 or 4 leopard geckos. And then my dad always hated snakes, so I brought home a ball python, and then a Kenyan sand boa, and then I think day geckos. But
did your dad ever warm up to the snakes, or was that always off limits?
He eventually got around to accepting them, to the point where, like, so we had a wood stove outside that heated the house, and he like in the woodpile would always like place like live traps and catch mice and be like, "Oh, does your snake want them?" And I'm like, "Not really," but like we lived in an area where like the middle of nowhere, no pesticides or anything. So I was like, "We'll see."
Thanks for helping.
Yeah, every once in a while, like the snake would be picky about like frozen thawed, and so every once in a while, like I'd offer him one of the live ones to get him going again, so he didn't go on the typical ball python hunger strike.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it's ever since then, it's been at least like 3 or 4 kicking it around, and
Yeah. So the classic sort of reptile story, and then eventually you went to school with. I think did you get an undergrad in biology?
Yep, biology and chemistry, and we weren't supposed to have animals in the dorms, but I will not say I did not. Which thankfully I also worked in the science department when I was an undergrad. I TA'd a lot of classes, did a lot of tutoring, and I worked in the chemical stock room. And so some of the professors let me keep some of the animals like in one of the labs because we had like a display like reef tank in the back, and I did all the maintenance for those. And so they're like, "Yeah, like bring up some of your gecko cages." And so I did that, and then I was when I was TAing comparative anatomy. Actually, we used to bring out the leopard geckos for a break because it was a lot. I did basically open labs at night, so students could come in and work on their dissections and stuff for the class, and they were there basically like sometimes 3-4 hours. And so about once an hour, I'd take out one of the geckos and allow people to come up to the front for like a mental break. And it worked really well. The students loved it.
Oh, that's awesome.
Geckos tolerated it. So
Yeah. So was your plan always, even from a kid, to follow an academic path for studying animals of some sort?
To a degree. When I was really young, I wanted to be a marine biologist. And then I started undergrad as a bioeducation major. And then very quickly decided in my freshman year that I didn't have the patience to teach people, at least not in like the conventional sense. But I've always loved research. Like the critical thinking aspect always keeps my mind turning. And so that's more so what I've focused on. By default, by association, I've had to teach additional classes and stuff. But for the most part, like I've restricted myself to teaching like more upper level classes. So it's more so students that already have a general background, and it's more specialized classes. Like I've done genetics on a number of occasions, the comparative anatomy, molecular biology, bioinformatics, developmental neuroscience. So it's not, and none of it's like the, hey, bio foundations, where it's people taking it for a gen requirement and things like that.
Right. And they hate it and they don't want to do it.
You have to spend a half an hour teaching them how to pipette and how to hold it.
Meiosis and mitosis.
Yeah, like you guys already know these things, like at least like the upper level classes. You're getting more reasonable questions instead of the same ones over and over because students don't want to listen.
Yeah. In terms of your PhD, tell me about that.
So I initially, or in undergrad, I had done some research on forensic toxicology, so identifying drugs that are in compound with other things. And then that was something that I really liked. I've always liked chemistry. I don't get to use it much currently, but so my PhD is in general biology, but my thesis is on developmental neuroscience. So I'm specifically looking at a family of transcription factors and how they interact with other proteins or transcription factors to influence the cell fate. So I'm specifically trying to look at how they dictate how a cell can go from a neural progenitor cell that can become any part of the neural system to then a committed neuron and then a mature neuron. Like what kind of tips that balancing point. And specifically the family of proteins that I look at, they all share the same target sequence on DNA. So a lot of their specificity is dictated by the proteins they're interacting with. So I'm trying to kind of map out that interactome to see if they're interacting with different partners at different times, or if it just depends on which partners are available, and so on and so forth.
Interesting. So, are you only using one species of, I think it was, you said frogs to study that?
Yes. So our lab uses Xenopus laevis, which is the African clawed frog. And one of the interesting things about them actually as a species is they are what's called allotetraploid. So whereas humans, we're diploid, so we have 2 copies of every gene. These frogs, they have 2 sets of 2 copies. Basically, when they were evolving, 2 sets of genomes merged and then never properly underwent cell division. So they have basically what's referred to as a short set of chromosomes and a long set. Whereas the short set over time had some areas that are redundant, deleted or removed, or just failed to replicate. So their chromosomes are a little bit shorter in that set. But the long set is more thought to be ancestral. And so the particular protein that I'm studying, those 2 sets are actually, they have a few significant differences. So we're also trying to assess whether or not that has implications for their evolution, both because one copy is more similar to what we have as humans, and we share a very similar copy with things like chick and mouse, but the other copy is very similar to what things like zebrafish have, and a more ancestral version. So we're trying to figure out whether or not those significant differences play a factor in the complexity of the nervous system as it's developing.
Very interesting. Yeah, that'll be a very interesting project, and I know that's something that you're going to try to wrap up this year. Hopefully, that will be kind of the goal. Yeah, very good. So I guess to break down that into, I just want to, maybe for some people who don't have a biological background, just to quickly tie that into that, because I do want to talk about your breeding as well. But it's essentially, you're looking at, you have, I guess, could you call them stem cells, and you're looking at what factors allow them to differentiate into the specific neurons or nervous tissue that they eventually turn into?
Yes. So unlike typical stem cells, when people think of them, like they can become like anything.
Right.
We specifically focus on their neural stem cells, so they're limited to that lineage at least. It's not going to be something that's going to become like intestinal tissue, but they can still become anything in the neural like branch of the tree.
Yeah. So they're stuck in that pie chart of the nervous tissue or neurons, and very cool. That's super interesting. So, and then at some point you started your breeding operation. Tell me about Gecko Labs and sort of what started that.
So my senior year of undergrad, I'd gotten a lot more animals. More so, there was a local mom and pop shop that occasionally would buy some of the babies back and whatnot. And usually I would just exchange them for other species they had gotten in. Like I'd gotten additional day geckos, some brown basilisks, and so on. And so that was kind of when I saw like, hey, like I could actually like expand my collection, get things that I really like going this route. And then when I started grad school, when I moved down here, I had gotten a handful of leopard geckos, because also like I've always been a genetics nut. So like I was drawn to them and the different traits and phenotypes that they have. And so I'd gotten a handful of them. And initially when I got them, the goal was, hey, like I'll breed these for 2-3 seasons, produce enough to then move all the stock, and then basically climb up the ladder in things that I like. And so I went from the Euplepharus to then Goniurosaurus. And then around the time that I had the Goniurosaurus, a good friend had reached out who was having some medical issues and was going to have surgery. So she was like, hey, I'm not going to be able to take care of anything. Do you want to take in my collection? And I was like, if you give me like a rough head count to know what to plan for, like, sure, like that's not an issue. And like, she never gave me like a final head count. She just told me like what size box she was sending out. So I was like, all right, like that's fine. And cause I didn't want to pester her, because I knew she was having like a lot of pain issues, and all of her animals were in the basement. And so the box got there, and to date, it has been the largest box I've ever received. And so my better half has always like really liked the New Caledonian geckos, like the crested geckos. And like that was most of what was in the box. It was something like 35 cresties, like 10 gargs, a bearded dragon that we forwarded to another friend that was taking it in for, and then some knobtail geckos, and some additional Goniurosaurus. And so I was in the process when we took her collection in of, it was my final or second to last season that I worked with the leopard geckos. And we got all that stuff in. I was like, all right, like we set them up like in quarantine enclosures that were pretty simple and cheap. And then the goal was, hey, by the time they're ready to exit quarantine, I want to have most of the leopard geckos moved so we can put all that money into housing all of these more adequately. And that's what we did. We kept around, I think it was my second to last season breeding the Leos, because we moved most of the babies and a couple of breeders and kept a small group for the next year. But I trimmed everything back down to one small rack for the eublepharid that needed heat anyway. And then I had a stack of the Goniarosaurus in the other room. But yeah, the entire goal, the entire time I've been keeping has been kind of move up that ladder to what I like, and things that often get ignored. And we had another friend before I took in that collection that had a lone male Abernia gramineae that she had imported from Europe that was still a small little thing. And she was like, hey, like it seems to be like really stressed since we moved its enclosure like around other things, but I don't have anywhere else to put it, that I think it'll be more like secure. Like, would you be interested in it? And I was like, yeah, sure. Like, it's been a species that I've always eyed. And I knew she took great care of everything. And so I was like, what do you want for her? And she was like, oh, just trade me a couple of leopard geckos for my son. And I was like, okay.
Done.
And that was the male that started it all with everything from there. I instantly fell in love with the genus, and then very quickly like realized like the plight they face in the wild, between exploitation for the pet trade, and then their habitat also getting destroyed. Climate change isn't helping things either. But yeah, from there, it's been a slope, just basically from the time that I got him, the collection is very steadily shifted over to oviviparous things instead of egg layers. But yeah, it's been a ride.
Yeah, and it's a very different. There's like two types of breeders. There's breeders who have very kind of sort of what you're doing with a niche. You have a few different species you're working with and keeping it relatively small. And then you have sort of the other side where you might be just working with one species and mass producing. And I know even on your website, you talk about sort of having a shift in focus away from, I don't know if you ever were focusing on quantity, but you said you focus on specifically quality and making sure enclosures are really, high level quality care and watching the behaviors of the animals, and obviously focusing on conservation as well. So were those seeds always there as part of just being an animal lover, or how did that come into play into the breeding operation?
So they were always there, but I think really when I got that first Abronia was when it really took a hard shift. Like they've always been there, and I've always cared more about like making sure the animals were content and thriving. But then once I got that male in, it was all the enclosures basically got overhauled. Like I wanted to make sure everything had like adequate enrichment and so on and so forth. And it's definitely taken a lot more hold over everything in recent years, but it was always there.
Yeah, it's like for me, that's what I feel like that is what every breeder should almost have as a philosophy, keeping that. Obviously, we always want to have a foot inside the conservation side, especially when you're working with a species like Abronia, because there's not a lot of captive breeding going on. How many do you have now?
Around 35 to 40-ish.
A good size.
Yeah, we have a pretty good amount. We have a fair number of species. And we have so far confirmed 3 females about to drop litters. I still haven't done ultrasounds on all of them, so there's likely more. But so we're still like in a small-ish space. And so I haven't put much focus into the actual reproduction. I've been pretty selective on what I've put together and left together. And have been more so just focusing on making sure that everything's as healthy as possible, as happy as possible. So that way when we do move into a larger space, like I can shift that focus without it taking a toll on the animals.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so what do you think the importance of operating that way is? Because you might have somebody who has 1,000 ball pythons in a rack or 1,000 leopard geckos in a rack, and do you think it's possible to convince those types of breeders that the quality and the conservation and the behavioral side is important, or do you think just like a personal preference?
So I think it's a little bit of both. I think a lot of the issue is that a lot of people that get into the hobby and keeping, they see what's most popular on like YouTube or on Facebook, which is a lot of people keeping in more naturalistic or sterile enclosures because it saves money and saves time. But in the long run, when you're setting up things in more naturalistic enclosures, which can still be done in racks, I've done it for the leopard geckos. After I think my second season, I always kept on substrate, even though they were in the racks. And so they had that enrichment of being able to dig, being able to lay their eggs wherever they wanted. And they still had hides. They still had a proper thermal gradient. They still had proper humidity. So it's not impossible. And the thing too is if you do that, you can still seed those enclosures with springtails and isopods and have it basically be a bioactive tub in a rack. And a lot of people don't realize that, I think. And when it boils down to it, like that's saving you money. Like, yeah, your racks get a little heavier because all the tubs have dirt in them. And you're spending that money up front for the whatever substrate you're going to use and the microfauna. But in the long run, you're not going through 3 rolls of paper towels every other week. You're creating a lot less waste in that regard. And all you have to do is spot clean the enclosure.
Yeah, it's almost more like once you get it's almost like a startup cost is more, but once you have it going and you have everything set up, the expense is almost less in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. Because like I don't even culture that many isopods, but like what I do culture, I can seed back into enclosures nice and easily. Like I have I think it's a Zilla skyscraper that I set up for a trio of Gastrophilis persina, and I threw maybe 10 dairy cow isopods in there when I set it up. And when I go through there now and spray and turn the soil, there's hundreds of them. And they're cleaning up all the poop. They're eating the shed. They're also serving as another feeder diversity option. Like I've caught the gastros feeding on them on multiple occasions. And it's just overall, like it's more enriching for the animals. It keeps everything cleaner. It keeps the odor down. And
the odor, that's a big one that people don't think about. It's amazing how much different the odor is when you go bioactive. It's just, there's nothing. It just smells like plants.
Yep. Especially depending on how much charcoal you incorporate to the soil too, because that's just going to soak it all up.
Yeah.
And like when I've had people ask like what substrate mix I use, and I tell them, and I point out like, hey, like I use a significant amount of charcoal. And they're like, oh, what's that for? Like I only see people culturing springtails on it. And I'm like, put it in the substrate in one tank and leave it out in the other and notice the difference after a month.
So what do you do for substrate? You mix charcoal in with just do you just do your own sort of blend of bioactive mixture?
Yeah, so I get the huge bales of peat moss, and then the bags of play sand, and then organic potting soil, and the horticultural charcoal, and the bales of sphagnum moss, and I rehydrate those, and I chop it up really finely so it's not long fiber anymore, just because it helps more so the aesthetic and keeping it from, because eventually otherwise if the cages are agitated, the dirt falls through the sphagnum. Whereas if it's finely chopped, when you churn it, it's not just leaving the sphagnum on top and then the dirt all on the bottom. So that's more of a personal preference. But yeah, mix all those things in different ratios depending on what kind of cage you're going into. And that's pretty much it.
And even those ingredients are pretty cheap. Like a bale of peat moss and all those, probably the most expensive thing in that is the sphagnum moss tends to be a little more expensive, but not even that bad.
Yeah, I think between the sphagnum and the charcoal are probably the 2 most expensive just because of how much of the charcoal I use. But you can also use natural charcoal too. Like as long as you're not running a fire with
gas,
with additives and stuff like that, then you can take all that charred wood and break it apart and use that. I've done that on numerous occasions and made batches of substrate for friends whose fire pit I collected the charcoal from.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what about your Abronia, for example? We'll use that as like a little case study. What do you have them in terms of the actual enclosure?
So depending on where they're positioned, I have a few different style enclosures that I utilize. Some of them are in the all screen ones, but the areas that get a little bit more airflow and dry out quicker, I have them in at least solid sided, but still screen front. And at the moment, I'm actually in the process of transitioning over. Leland at DW Geckos is in the process of making a couple of cages for me to test out that are a lot of his are typically for like the baker rack style, like the wire shelving, but I use the larger industrial ones. So he's making some deeper ones for me, which he's also fallen on hard times. So I will put a plug in for the Madison Area Herpetological Society fundraising group, who's just starting off a benefit auction for him because he did have some medical issues and is currently in the hospital.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I'll put that in the show notes. Of course, so I've had Ryan McVeigh on the show before, and so we're familiar with that. And yeah, I'll definitely include that in the show notes. It's always good when we can help a member of the community out. So the concept, do you think that at the end of the day, if you breed in more of an enriching way, kind of have that quality focus first, is there a massive expense in terms of the animal that you sell? Like, do you have to sell? I mean, maybe not for you because you're not, I don't know if you're looking at your bottom line really, or you're just doing this for more fun. But if someone's trying to run a business, do you think they can actually operate in that way and still make money?
I definitely think so, because it still boils down to, it depends on the species as well. So if you're like operating that way, but exclusively breeding, for example, like morning geckos or house geckos, then you'll probably get a little bit higher production because they're happier animals. But at the end of the day, people are still only wanting to pay $25-$35 for a morning gecko. So you can still make a profit. It'll take longer to do so. But to me, like, that's entirely worth it. I don't care much about like what we make. Like, the extra is great, but almost every time we get extra, it's going right back into the animals anyway. Especially like right now, like we're my better half is hopefully going to be starting at vet school next August. And so while she's there, and I'll likely have a postdoctoral position or a lab tech position, so I'll be making a little bit more money, but we'll be losing a large amount of our influx with her being back in school. So right now, like, we're focused on like getting breeding groups set up with other species, and like I'm still trying to focus on things that are often ignored, like the flying geckos. Like, not a lot of people are breeding them in captivity. I've had pretty good success with them so far. I think in our enclosure we've got 9 eggs around the walls, and I've got a couple growing out, stuff like that. But so I think eventually, like, we're getting to a point where things are getting more return for us, which is nice. At the end of the day, so long as the animals are happy, like, that's what I care about.
That's your number one.
Yeah.
Like, for one, I love that you're working with different species, and it's so nice to see different things being brought into the trade, because I think that's important. And for me, if I ever got into breeding, it would be the same sort of plan. Like, I wouldn't really care about the bottom line as much. It would be more about the quality of the animals, but there are certain people who use that as their livelihood, and I always wonder if I think the industrialized style care is just not good for the industry, because way too many people are caring in that way, just paper towel and a Dixie cup for your water dish.
Yeah.
And I always wonder if there's space in there for those people to grow while maintaining some form of economics, really. Yeah. And it sounds like there probably is.
Yeah. For like one person that I know pretty closely, for example, Chase Carmadroy from Zengex, like, his enclosures are simple and clean, but they all have really adequately sized enclosures that are really enriching. And he made sure to put all that money in up front, so his animals were really happy. And because of that, he gets really good production.
And healthy animals, and easy to sell because people know the quality.
Yeah, and like, he makes a good living off of it. And he, so far as last I talked about it, I don't think he plans on going bioactive or anything like that, just because of what he has works really well for him. But the animals are super happy. So there is room for that there. I think it's just a matter of people needing to realize that, like, hey, like, if that's the route I want to go, then I need to make sure to be putting money back into the animals. So like,
you have to reinvest.
Yeah, because like, one thing I've talked to him about before is like, hey, like, with like certain pairs of animals, like, one season's worth of babies, even just one clutch sometimes pays for like that set of enclosures for the adults. So it's not like you're funneling back out a bunch of money out of pocket, but they pay for themselves, and especially when they're nice and happy.
Yeah. Yeah. It does pay for itself and eventually there'll be a profit. Maybe it's a slightly longer game, but in the end, there's definitely more benefit to it. And one other thing that I really like about even your website is really nice and it's a really professional website. And that's a flaw almost in the reptile trade is there's so many horrible reptile websites out there, whether it's stores or breeders, and you go in and it's just like, there's nobody maintaining the website, and yours just looks like a real website. Is it Shopify or what are you using as a platform?
Wix.
Oh, it's Wix. Wow. Yeah, no, that looks awesome. So everybody should go check out, it's Gecko Laboratory or Gecko Labs?
Gecko Laboratory.
Yeah, I'll put that in the show notes, of course, because it's just, it looks just, it's one of those things where when you look at it, you'd be comfortable buying geckos from you or animals from you because it just looks good.
That's the goal.
Yeah. It's not like a basement kind of weird thing where, no, it's just awesome. And you even have like a little reward system there.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
So initially, I thought I was going to be able to incorporate it directly to the site. So it's basically live purchases, you get 10% back for basically credit. Food purchases, you get 5% back. And basically, like what I do is every time somebody orders, I have a spreadsheet that I put the invoice number in, like what category it fell under, or if it falls into a split category, I split up those amounts. So that way there's basically 2 rows for that invoice. And each customer gets their own ID number. And whenever they want to redeem it, they just shoot me an email. And within 2 days, I'll figure out how much they have and shoot them a coupon code for that amount. So it's a little
awesome.
involved, it creates more work on my end, but I'd rather have the customers get discounts and keep people happy and returning. So
yeah, it makes so much sense. And you have them returning to you, and it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy of good quality animals going, because the people that are buying animals from you must have similar philosophy as well, right? Like they want to have good quality animals and they're coming to you for that reason.
I would like to think so.
That's awesome. So in terms of the conservation side, because this is something that I stumbled upon myself a few years ago, was when I was keeping these animals. I kept trying to advance their care and get closer and closer to their natural environment. And then I got to the point where I'm like, why do I even have these animals? Like, what's the point of keeping them in captivity if my goal is to just replicate their wild? Maybe I shouldn't even own them at all. That was sort of the ethical conundrum that I came up with. And I think there are some good reasons to have animals in captivity. So what do you think are some of the benefits of having animals captive?
So there are tons of benefits, but one of the biggest things that a lot of people often don't think about is that the capacity to keep some of these animals, even if it's basic species like leopard geckos that have been bred in captivity for decades, it still gets that young kid that gets his first gecko experiencing nature, especially if they live in an area where they otherwise can't. Like if it's in a big city, they can't have a dog or a cat, but they can have a gecko in an aquarium or a vivarium. That gets them connected to nature, gets those gears turning, and hopefully blossoms into something where they care more about nature, care more about animals, and care more about their environment. But also, like from a more scientific aspect, a lot of habitats are being either destroyed, completely obliterated, or becoming non-suitable because of temperature fluctuations where the animals can't adjust as quickly as the globe is warming. And so a lot of it boils down to like whether or not, like, I'm not going to say that like, hey, like my keeping a Bronia is going to repopulate their habitat, because it's not. Animals that are in captivity almost never are suitable for that, unless they're brought in specifically for that purpose. So you have places like different zoological or conservation facilities that have assurance populations. Like a good example is like the Smithsonian. They have the Atelopus toads that they've been breeding at a site down in Panama for reintroduction. But things like a lot of keepers like to preach the conservation through captive propagation, and barely any of them know what that means. They just see people saying it, and that's their argument. But when it boils down to it, a very small percentage of keepers that I've met or talked with or interacted with in any way have like the slightest inclination of how to maintain adequate genetic diversity over a long period of time in a captive population.
Right.
And those are the kind of things that go into that. And not to say that like keeping things and getting people educated about them, like that still boils into conservation. But a lot of the people chanting this are the same people that are like, oh, like we're protecting the species, which unless you're mass producing them, so that way you're eliminating that demand for wild caught, then you're not. Or if you're producing them on a smaller level and you're giving some of that money back to protect the habitat, which is something that we do. So I make at least annual donations down to IRCF and their project in Guatemala that protects the Bronia and Eloderma. And basically every species that I get that's more of like kind of a rare species, that's something that I look into. So like the lizards from Sri Lanka that I have, or that are endemic to Sri Lanka, those, before I even got them, like I started looking around like, hey, like what preserves can I donate proceeds back to? And help that, because I know their habitat's diminishing. They're really susceptible to the temperature changes because they're small lizards, and they dehydrate easily. And they've had like a massive drought in the recent years, so they're not getting anywhere near the level of humidity and hydration that they've evolved to be accustomed to.
Right.
And then same thing with like we have the Tenosaura bakeri that is endemic to a very small island off of Honduras. And there's a couple of groups that are involved down there with their protection and population assistance programs. And so once I eventually to get them to stop being stubborn and produce, proceeds from that will go back down to them, and so on. So there's a lot of different ways that people can get involved and help fund conservation efforts besides just like making a donation to some random organization. Especially like if you find a species that you absolutely fall in love with, why not make sure you're putting in that effort to help make sure that they're still in the wild?
Right. Yeah, and that's so true, because I think a lot of times breeders fall into that trap of just saying, "Hey, this is for conservation," when that's like you said, they just say it and then they're done with it. And when you actually look down to the facts, it's like, well, A, there's not enough genetic diversity to make that happen, and B, almost no captive breeding ends up in the wild anyway. So what you're saying is kind of just you're just saying it so you can feel good almost in a way.
Yeah.
And so the ways to actually support conservation would be finding the areas that you want to protect. And that's one of the things I do here with the podcast is I have a close relationship with the charity that conserves sections of the Peruvian Amazon rainforest. And I don't make donations as well because I know the animals that I have come from there. It's really important that, I'm directing some income that way. So I think that is a really unique thing that people could add to their breeding business. If you have a species, just funnel a little bit. It doesn't have to be much, right? 10% or 5% or something that's just making its way there so you can actually help with conservation.
Yep. And like a lot of it too, like boils down to like some of the more obscure species like the Abronia. Like a lot of people, I don't see it as much anymore in the Abronia groups, but a lot of people used to chant the whole conservation through captive propagation. And at least like with the Abronia or some other species that fall under the same kind of net, if we do get to the point where we're producing enough in captivity to meet that demand for the trade, then we get to a point where we get to dictate like, hey, like the cost for captive bred, we're going to drop to de-incentivize people from buying the smuggled wild caught ones. But then we run into a game where the people selling the smuggled ones, be it they know or be it they're doing it knowingly or burying their head in the sand, where they'll just continue to drop prices because they're getting them at wholesale prices and they're brought in by the bucket.
Yeah, for people that aren't aware, wholesale prices are actually pretty disturbing when you see those price lists. If you've never seen a wholesale price list, you don't realize how cheap these animals are coming in. And like you said, buckets is not an understatement. Like they're coming in pails.
Especially for species like that are actually trafficked. For things that are legitimately imported, like they're typically taken better care of, but the wholesale prices still apply. Like you can get them fairly cheap. And especially if you get them, the larger the quantity you get, the cheaper you're going to get them per head. And so basically we're at a point now where I've been building up groups here where hopefully within the next couple of years, when I can really shift just towards focusing on the reproduction, where I can get large colonies set up of the various species. And some of the species, like I'll never offer publicly, period. They're going to be set strictly for if other conservation organizations are interested in them, or if zoological facilities are interested in them, and so on. And some of the species, like basically any of the species that were like larger in the trade when they were coming in a lot. So we have like the Mixteca, Gramineae, the Reptile. Those are some of the species that, like, once we build up a large enough colony and are producing enough per year, then I will offer them. But for the time being, I'm just building numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people get pissy about it because they're like, "Hey, like, you have any for sale?" And I'm like, "No." And they're like, "Well, we know you have a lot," and I'm like, "Yeah, I do." Like,
that's not what they're for.
Yeah. Like, if I cared about that, like, I'd be flaunting them all over. But I don't even post any of them, like, in the groups or anything like that, because I don't want to bring the negative drawbacks for the species of the social attention.
Yeah, well, and that's another thing that you've actually you mentioned on your website on one of the pages there, is just discussing how, and this is something I've said all the time, is that social media is not, I think it is a net negative a lot of ways for the reptile trade entirely, and for that exact reason. Like, people become very competitive and defensive, and you have a really unique set of species that you would love to post about, but at the same time, it's not even worth your trouble because of the backlash. You might have, people DMing you all this stuff, and it's social media. It almost is like regression to the mean in a way, where we just all come back to, well, like we were talking about, the people that conservation by propagation, that's the sort of thing that people post on social media, and it just gets regurgitated over and over.
Yep. And like, for some of the species, like, sure, social media is great. And you can teach a lot about a species via social media. But for the species that, like, are very aesthetically catchy, like the Abronia, like, people see them like, "Oh, I want one. Where can I get one?" And I'm not gonna direct you to that because you saw it and made an impulse decision that you want one. If you decide to go read care articles and come back and tell me that you are in search of a person that is captive breeding them and you want a captive bred individual, then I am more inclined to help guide you towards finding one.
Yeah, it's just a totally different mindset that you want them to come in with.
Yeah. It's a pain, and because of that, like, if I wanted to, like, I could grow the UAC Instagram page pretty much instantaneously, just blasting up posts after posts of Abronia. But like, I don't want that. I want a more organic audience that actually cares about the message we're trying to send, opposed to the aesthetics that we're posting.
Yes, that is a huge point. Like, there are two ways to grow a social media account. One is it's just entertainment, and you can just post whatever you want to grow numbers, or you can find the people who truly care about what you're doing, and it's going to be much smaller. The group it's going to take way longer to get to a much smaller number. So but the payoffs are way better because you're fostering a community of people who actually care, rather than people who just want to double tap on a picture. So tell me a little bit about Urban Ark Conservatory, or was it conservation, or So it was. Tell me about that. What's the history behind that organization?
So we started up kind of like brainstorming in late 2015. And then in 2016, like, we decided, like, hey, we're going to pull the trigger because we want to help make a difference with habitat protection and doing something to actually help species in the wild. And at the time, we weren't necessarily trying to focus on Abronia. It just happened to be a byproduct that, like, hey, it's a species that we know needs help. And we know that very few other private keepers are doing anything about it. And so we're pretty scattered focus-wise. So we have, like, the homestead up in Pennsylvania that my partner operates, which he's also focusing on veterans' health, mental health, because he himself is a vet. And agrotherapy has helped him a lot with his mindset. So he wants to get to the point where, like, at that facility up in PA, where we can have like guest lodges and stuff. So that way, if vets are returning home and need a place to stay, or just need a place to go clear their mind, like, they can go up there, help work with all the animals that are up there.
Because it's not just reptiles. You're saying agriculture. There's a bunch of different sort of farmland type.
Yeah. So up there we have, like, a small homestead. We have a couple. So basically, when we started the homestead, because the idea was, like, hey, sustainable living. And so we've developed to the point where now we have a geothermally heated aquaponics greenhouse. which in the next like year or two, we're hoping to get another couple of those erected. So that way we can have a pretty good spread for crop diversity coming from those. But the idea was initially like we wanted to get a greenhouse up so we could test it, work out some kinks and stuff like that, because that's the kind of thing that we want to help deploy in the communities that share habitats with like some of these species, especially where like in Central America, where a lot of the issue is small scale agricultural clearing of land. And so people are clearing it for like small cattle ranches and things like that. But if they have a community based sustainable development where they can go get their greens and get meat, because you can grow local. One of the biggest things was a lot of people for the hydroponic system use tilapia, which has been, it's caught some backlash because it's not native to a lot of areas. So people were either releasing them or they were getting out, whatever, and they were becoming invasive. And so I had spoken to a couple of colleagues from Central America and asked them like, hey, like what are common fish that would be suitable in these systems? And there's actually one that's relatively closely related to tilapia. I don't remember the name off the top of my head right now, but it's around the same size, stays a little smaller, but it seemed like a good fit. So we're hoping to get some of those and try it in the system.
So for those that don't know how that works, it's basically you have a fish in a tank essentially that are helping fertilize the plants through the hydroponic system, I think.
Right. So basically you have a big vat for a fish tank, basically. The excess and the waste from the fish gets filtered up into the water that basically fertilizes all the roots for the whatever crop you're growing. And some crops aren't very suitable for the system, but a lot of ways you can tweak the system to make them suitable. It really depends on like what you're trying to grow. So a lot of crops are pretty simple. You can put them in beds with just a bunch of the hydroton, the little clay pebbles, and their roots will go down through and be perfectly happy with just the water going through with the extra nitrates and everything from the fish. And then basically everything that before it hits the crops, it gets filtered and sterilized to a degree. So that way they're not getting like all the raw excrement from the fish, but it's what's beneficial for the plants without contaminating them. But those can be scaled up or down basically as much as you want. You could set up a 10-gallon aquarium in your house that you can grow different lettuces and herbs and stuff on top of using the same sort of setup. Or you can scale it to be a massive warehouse size where you can feed an entire community.
That's really interesting. So is the idea, it's almost a two-pronged approach. The idea with the land is basically you could live off that land and potentially eventually have people come there and help care for it as a part of like rehab from mental health issues and whatnot from coming back from military service. Was the land already there? Like, did your partner live on that land already?
When we first started, he didn't. But basically, so his parents have always been like super supportive of like what he wanted to do, and they were getting ready to sell their house and move. So that when they were looking at a new house and property, they were specifically looking at one that had enough open space to be able to work with for like these sort of ideas. And so I don't remember when they bought it. I think it was late 2016 or early 2017. So they've been there for a little while now. And he's been in the process of basically just continually building up different structures for the farm animals and stuff that are up there. And once he started like looking into the farm animals and stuff for more sustainable homestead up there, one of the things we came across was that like, hey, like there's actually breeds of different livestock that are classified as like threatened or endangered as well. While the species as a whole isn't, but like they're typically considered threatened or endangered to protect like their cultural value. And so we started looking into what we can do on that front as well, to still be contributing to the conservation of the breed and following that mission still, but having them also contribute towards a sustainable homestead. And so we have I believe it's 2 different breeds of goats currently, a handful of different poultry, and then a couple different breeds of pigs as well, that are all classified as either threatened or worse by the Livestock Conservancy.
That's very interesting. So, and I know that obviously with Gecko Labs, you do divert some of the cash that you get from there into that project. And And so what do you have as a vision for that in the end? Obviously continue to build the ability to basically live off that land. And then were you going to move some reptiles over there as well, or are you just going to kind of keep them separate?
So initially the thought process was, yes, to be able to move a bunch of the reptiles up there, but the end goal for me and UAC as an organization is to have satellite facilities as well. And so especially for like the Abronia, the ultimate goal is to be able to house them outside as big a portion of the year as possible, and which isn't really suitable in Pennsylvania. And so basically wherever I end up long-term, after my better half finishes that school, we're going to be looking at areas that have enough property to be able to set up additional greenhouses, whether or not I have to move the animals into them, or at least set up partially shaded areas and stuff like that to move the cages into. So that way it's an easy, instead of pulling animals out of enclosures and putting them in new ones for whatever time period, be it a day, a week, month, whatever, we can actually just physically wheel the enclosures out and leave all of the missing assemblies rigged up. So that way, if we do have a couple of days that are pretty dry, we still have the capacity to turn on the mister and let them have it.
Oh, that would be awesome. That's sort of like a reptile or conservationist dream in a way, having a facility like that. I guess in terms of location, you would be looking at like somewhere like Florida type scenario, or?
So there's a lot of areas that I've looked at. So far right now, long term, I'd either like to ideally end up in somewhere like Southern Oregon or the montane regions of Tennessee. Or even like a little bit further out in Virginia is pretty suitable most of the year.
You just have a short winter to deal with.
Yeah.
That's not too bad though. It's not like it's getting tons of snow.
In a bit further out in Virginia, most of the winter isn't that bad, especially like the last few years. Like there's been very few days where it's dropped below like 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And so as long as like pay attention to the forecast, I can work with that and wheel them in and out. So that way they're still getting exposure during the day, because the days during winter are actually pretty warm, especially like in the sun.
Right.
Like we've had over the last like 3-4 years, at least like 2 to 3 weeks in January to February where it's still like 70 degrees.
Really?
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
And the Abronia are relatively like they are cooler species in general, right? They're from a montane region, I think, for the most part, so they don't need to have high heat to begin with.
Right. And especially like in the cooler months like that, when they're have a shortened photo period and things like that, they can handle really low temperatures. It goes below freezing occasionally in their habitat.
Really?
Yeah. So a lot of times they avoid being directly exposed to it by they'll either nestle together in spots that are hollows in trees and stuff like that, or like underneath leaf litter that's been trapped inside of tillandsias or bromeliads. So they do get some insulation and shielding from the elements, but it does get pretty cold.
And there's just that benefit of having natural sunlight, which would be huge.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, I love this. I love your philosophy. I love what you're doing with your breeding operation. Of course, with Urban Ark is just amazing. And I think this is hopefully sort of the moving forward out of this industrial side. I do really see the industrialized breeding as a kind of a speed bump in our progression as a hobby. So I hope that people listen to this, and there are other ways you can have a breeding operation that do that quality and conservation and everything. So I really enjoyed this conversation. Do you have some interesting things there?
Yeah, I brought out some cherry-picked ones.
Oh, great. Let's take a look. So for those who are just listening, you're going to have to go check out the YouTube video so we can take a look at these guys.
So this is one of our gestating female Abronia lithotrila. She's been here for around 4 years now.
Wow.
She's actually
such a cool looking animal.
Yeah, she's pretty aggressive towards her mates, which so far seems to be, at least in my experience, is pretty restricted to the lithotrila. Some people say it's restricted to the portion of the genus that all has those auricular spines behind the head. But I've had Vasconcelosi and Burrita be perfectly fine with their mates year round. But I've spoken to a number of keepers now that have had lithotrila actually kill their mates.
Really?
And she is one of them. I walked in one day and found the male just on the bottom of the enclosure with a pretty severe kink in his neck. So I think it was he had attempted to breed and she wasn't receptive, and she grabbed and just twisted the right way.
And broke his neck.
Yep. But prior to that, like no issues whatsoever housing them together. They were perfectly fine. And so I'm fairly certain it was just the fact that like she just wasn't receptive anymore, which is part
So
of the
moving
reason.
forward, what are you going to do with that one?
So she right now is housed by herself. And I've actually begun to switch so that all of them are housed individually except for breeding introductions. So especially like once we get into a larger space, everything will be housed individually and only introduced for 2 to 3 week periods for breeding. And one of the big things that helps promote them to breed is actually like cycling out males. So the fact that the males will be housed by themselves for most of the year will avoid having to do that to cycle out.
Right.
Sometimes the competition is fairly good, but for the most part, it's not worth the risk.
Yeah, that's kind of surprising that a lizard like that would actually kill another. I mean, I guess it does happen in other areas of the trade as well. You see it with snakes all the time, eating their mates. Oh, there you go. Look at that guy.
And so these are the Ceratophora tenenti. So these are endemic to Sri Lanka. But I was fortunate to import a group of captive bred ones from a friend in the UK before they got listed on CITES under Appendix 1. And because a lot of them are poached from the wild, but they've actually been super fecundant since I've gotten them. So I've had them a little over a year now, and in that time they've laid in my small group of 3 females and 2 males over 200 eggs.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a species I've never seen. Like I've never seen that anywhere. There must be very few.
This is a
keeping them.
Pretty gravid female.
Oh yeah, she got that belly.
The male, you can see the males get a little bit larger rostrum.
Yeah.
But yeah, they are a super entertaining species. They're not terribly active unless they're disturbed. For the most part, they just kind of sleep on vertical branches and call it a day.
Are they nocturnal?
They're not technically, but the best way that I can describe their activity pattern is like that of a cat. They nap 24 hours a day and wake up and have little bursts of cracked energy.
So if you're in the room at the right time, you might catch them moving around.
Especially like they're very food motivated, and they do have high metabolism. So I usually feed them at least every other day. So I catch them active pretty frequently.
Are you feeding most of them just crickets, or do you have a bunch of different things?
So primarily crickets, and then also roaches and stuff like that. Those guys in particular, being that they're from a very moist area, they also really love like slugs. So I've let slugs go rampant in the morning gecko enclosures, and I just pluck them out when I find them and toss them in with the Ceratophora.
Oh, cool.
And then this is a Gidgee skink, Bigrinia stokesi.
Oh, cool.
She is rather gravid as well.
Oh yeah, she's definitely a little pudgy there.
Yeah. So these guys are another live-bearing species. They're endemic to Australia. This particular species has been bred in captivity for a number of generations now. In our experience, they've been super easy to breed. I got a group with a couple of friends 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, and I raised them all up from little babies, and by the time they all hit like a mature size, she had a litter last October, and one of the other females from the group had a litter in January, I believe it was. And she's gravid again. One thing that I've noticed is that so a lot of people will tend to keep them warm most of the year and then part of the year cool them, which I do, but also I give them a nice night drop all year long. And with doing that, I've noticed that actually so one thing that we noticed before she gave birth to the last litter was that she already had follicles cycling again. which I didn't think much of. But then like she got really big again really quickly. So I was like, oh, hey, she's gravid again. And we just took her in for ultrasounds 2 weeks ago, I think it was, maybe last week. And she's certainly gravid again, and again has follicles already developing. And one thing that I noticed around 2 weeks ago was that the male was already chasing her around and breeding her again. And so basically she's been in a continual cycle of having fertilized embryos developing.
And do you think it's a lot associated with giving her a night drop?
I believe so, yeah. And because a lot of people will basically, for a couple of months, they'll either have their basking lights on for a very short period or just leave them off entirely if they have like a warm room. And that room, it stays pretty warm during the day. Like the ambient is around like 86. And then their basking spot when that's on is around 110 to 115. But then at night, it drops down to 70 or below. And so they've been perfectly happy. They've grown like weeds. And have been continually reproductively active.
Yeah, I think night drops are really interesting because there's a lot of people that don't do that, and I feel like almost every species would be actually healthy for them to drop the temperatures at night.
Yeah, and so that's actually one of the things that we've looked at cooling in general with the Bronia. Thankfully, our exotic vet is very interested in reproductive physiology as well, especially for the oviviviparous species. And so that's why we've been able to ultrasound a lot of them and kind of look at what stage of the follicles are in, at what time of year, and so on. Because initially, for species like that everybody thought required a cooling, they thought it was primarily for the male to produce fresh sperm. But what we've actually found so far with our limited sample size has been that the cooling and coming out of that cooling is very tightly associated with the vitellogenesis or yolk death position in the follicles. So it's actually triggering the cycling progression of the females as well.
Right. Interesting.
And then here we have another Sri Lankan endemic, which is the...
Oh, wow.
Oh, come here.
He's making a run for it.
He's trying. So this is one of the smaller species of Caledonians. This is a full-grown adult male. They fire up and down similar to like cresties do and chameleons when they're stressed. So typically he's a very vibrant green, and then all these bands are a very baby blue, which you can kind of still see on his face.
Wow, that is a beautiful looking animal.
Yeah, they're very entertaining. I've had the species here for quite a while, and then a friend that was working with, because he had imported a group of, I believe it was 9 unsexed babies a couple of years ago, and he raised them all up. That's where these ones came from. And he was getting eggs from them pretty continually, but either wasn't finding them in time or they just weren't incubating well. And so especially since I was seeing good success with the Stratophora, he was like, hey, do you want to take these? Because I can't get the eggs to hatch. And I was like, all right, sure. And I've got some fertile eggs in the incubator now, which are about 2/3 of the way through incubation.
And this is your first clutch?
First fertile one since they've been here.
Oh, cool. That's another species I've just never seen. I love that. I love having a diversity. It's like, where's your corn snake? Nothing wrong with corn snakes, but it's nice to see some different species in the mix.
That's what they're actually, I have the only 2 pairs in the States.
Really?
I'll
wow.
be holding back all of the babies.
Yeah, no kidding.
And here we have another, this is a terrestrial alligator lizard, Baresia rudicolus. So these guys are live bearing as well, from similar habitats to the Abronia, except they just stay in the leaf litter. And they do tend to be semi-fossorial. So those guys I set up with tunnel systems in their enclosures.
How did you do that?
So depending on the enclosure, most of these guys I have with a 3-inch diameter PVC tubes that I have basically cut in small enough sections that I can reach in the entire way. So I silicone around the entire inside and basically stuff it full of dirt until it cures. So they're all textured in like an actual tunnel instead of being smooth.
Right.
And then I have like various outlets for them to come in and out of. And
oh, that's very cool.
Try and keep that buried by cork and stuff so it stays mostly shaded. But then when I do heavy mistings, I'll mist inside of that. So it's a nice, cool, humid hide for them to retreat to.
Awesome.
Which Some of them use it more than others, but I prefer to provide it and have it not utilized than have them need it and not have it.
Yeah, exactly. That makes sense.
And then these are the main group that we work with commercially, at least, for funding all of our odds and ends projects is the New Caledonian Geckos. So here we have a small...
he just punched the microphone.
Yeah. Here. So this is a Urodactylodes agricolae, female. This is full grown. And then the male, as a typicality for the genus, the males are decently smaller than the females.
Yeah, he's very small. Well, they're both pretty small.
Yeah, they stay really small. Pairs can pretty much stay together year round so long as there's no issues. Like I've kept these guys together for 2 years now. Every once in a while, the female gets snippy, but it's usually just around egg laying.
They're so interesting. They're almost like a tiny, less chubby lychee gecko almost.
Yeah.
Like the same kind of pattern.
And so one of the interesting things about them is actually they have an interesting defense mechanism, which is only, so far as I'm aware of, known in 2 genera, which is the Urodactylodes and then Strophoris, which are endemic to Australia, where when they feel threatened, they have glands in their tail that they can secrete a kind of caustic and sticky substance from. So it smells a little bit, it stings, and it's very sticky.
Wow.
But yeah,
so it's almost like a musking that a snake would do.
Yeah, and so they're super interesting geckos. They typically don't do it. The female I've had do it once, and it was when I initially unboxed her when she arrived. So she was just stressed out from shipping.
So is it glands that just run the length of the tail, kind of like sweat glands almost?
Somewhat. I think there's a couple of basically like stripes of them scattered throughout the tail.
Interesting.
Like I know with Strophoris, basically kind of if you look really closely at the tail, you can sometimes see the pore where it's opened. These guys, you can't really see it just because their tails are so dark.
Right.
But for some of the Strophoris, you can actually kind of see that. And it's really interesting. I know there's a couple of good videos that have been floated around and gone viral of the Strophoris doing it from somebody that found one in situ in Australia. But I don't think there's been any videos of the Urodactylodes doing it. And then here we have Chihuahua gecko.
Oh, yes.
Which are quickly becoming a favorite.
Those are starting to become more popular, I feel like. Chihuahuas, I'm starting to see more of them.
Yeah, definitely starting to see more of them. I think people have started to realize like the phenotypic variability that they can have, which people are still selectively breeding for different looks and whatnot. But I'm like both from our pair that's breeding this year have like a kind of greenish collar on them.
It's like a mossy pattern almost.
And a lot of people really like the really stark like white collars look. But these are species that I got into because I decided, hey, there are species that like they don't breed terribly easy, but they're not terribly difficult either. Pretty much same care as crusteds, except they like it a little bit more humid and they like a lot more protein. And they need a bit higher calcium intake because their eggs are very heavily calcified. But for the time,
so with the New Caledonians, are you can most of them eat like a crested gecko diet, and then you're mixing in some insects as well?
Yeah. So basically, these guys they'll still eat like all the commercial diets, the Pangea, Rapashi, and BPZ and whatnot. But they basically like we typically feed our crusteds and like the agricolae and the gargoyles bugs once a week, and we'll feed these guys at least twice a week for the bugs.
Got it.
Like I have them housed in line with some of the Abronia. So when the Abronia get bugs, these guys get bugs.
Got it. Interesting.
And they're pretty active hunters when there's bugs in there. So I usually throw in a fair amount because they're another species similar to like leeches. Like they'll, to an extent, they'll pair bond. So once you've got a pair that's compatible, you can just leave them together. Some people will choose to pull once they know the female's gravid. Just to avoid any issues. I'll probably pull him back out after I get a fertile clutch from her, just so I know that he got his job done, and that way it minimizes stress on her moving forward in the season.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Because ultimately, like they're another species that like I'll probably hold back most of the babies this year, just to expand.
And just build out the collection.
Yeah. Ultimately, the goal over the next couple of years is to cut back on the crested numbers, to refine the quality that we're producing there for offspring, aesthetically. And then basically within that space that we're going to be clearing out some of the cresteds, have additional pairs of Chihuahua and Lychees, things that don't necessarily breed as easily, but we don't have to deal with housing as many babies because they don't produce as many babies as cresteds. But things that are still going to be able to sell for enough that we can contribute decent amounts towards conservation.
So for the species where you're one of the only ones in the U.S. to have a pair or a couple breeding pairs, in terms of genetic diversity, what are your concerns there?
So for the most part, being that there are species that like I keep out of personal preference because they're very cool behaviorally. They're pretty bold animals, and obviously they're gorgeous aesthetically. So I'm keeping them just more so out of personal preference. They're not a species that I'm looking to see mass produced and available to everybody. And for the most part, like the pairs that are together are the pairs that I'm going to leave together. And eventually I'll probably switch it up. Maybe probably not next year, but the year after. So that way I can set up minimally related pairs with their offspring. But for the most part, like because it's not a species that I have any hopes of seeing mass produced and available, I'm not terribly worried about it. And there are also species that they're endemic to Sri Lanka, so we're not going to get any more of them out. The ones that were imported a couple of years ago were from an oddball female that had been already in a collection for a number of years. And then these guys weren't actually formally described until 2014.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so people had them, but prior, like they were nested under, I believe, Nigrabilis. And so people would just assume that's what they were. And then when they were formally described and people like dedicated keepers that could see like those differences that were keyed out in the paper saw that and said like, hey, like this isn't what we thought it was. This is a different species. But then last year, we were hoping to be able to import some additional ones last year, but hasn't been much luck hatching them lately. And then Sri Lanka put forth the CITES proposal to have them listed, which the one for them got rejected. So they're not currently on CITES, but because they were a species that was proposed, it's a species that most likely Fish and Wildlife won't clear to come in.
Right.
Though, for the most part, when species like that do come in, because they're not distinguishable really when they're young and sexed. So a lot of times when they're coming in, they're only ID'd down to the genus. So like on the record, they'll say like Caledonian species in like the Fish and Wildlife database, even if they're labeled on their container as Caledonian Geckos. So there is some leniency there where there could be some still able to come in if people are able to hatch more in Europe. But for the most part, I've got the group I've got. I'm going to continue working with them because I enjoy them. And eventually I'll probably let go of a few pairs to select people that I know would do well by the species. But other than that, it's not a species that I'll ever post up available like on the website.
Yeah, it's just to have and just propagate good genetics and keep for yourself, just to
especially
have that slice.
Species that like they don't produce a lot. So whereas the Ceratophora, like they've produced over 200 eggs over the course of a year. These guys, I've finally just started getting fertile eggs from them after having them set up for almost a year and cycling them really heavily. And I'm actually, within the next couple of weeks, I'll probably have a second clutch from both of the females. But there are species that if I can get them to hatch is the first thing. And baby agamids are pretty sensitive. So whether or not I can get them to grow to adult size, which given the success with the Stratophora so far shouldn't be an issue, but I'm not going to count my chickens before they hatch. But yeah, so I'm going to continue expanding the group that I have and work with that. And if I get to a point where I'm producing enough that I can't continually house them, then I'll offload some minimally related pairs to people that I know will do well by them.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love the vision that you have in those animals. So thank you very much for showing those. Those are incredibly interesting, especially because most people have not seen them before, I'm sure. Can you let everybody know where they can find you online, the different links and social media and whatnot?
So for the Gecko Labs aspect, we have our Facebook page, which is just Gecko Labs. And then we have our Instagram, which is just Gecko Labs as well. And then online, our website is geckolaboratory.com. And then for the conservation portions, you can find us on both Facebook and Instagram at Urban Ark Conservation. And then our website is urbanarkconservation.org. Or if you slap a little store dot in front of that, you can head to our Shopify that has some merch on there that helps build up our funds towards land acquisition and the programs that we're hoping to employ.
Fantastic. Well, Dillon, thank you very much for joining me today. Just over an hour of time. That was awesome. This was a pleasure.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
All right, that is the end of that episode. Dillon, thank you very much for dropping by. I do really appreciate it. And thanks again for showing me the animals and showing the listeners the animals, because that was totally unexpected and extremely cool of you to do that. For the listeners out there, thank you very much for listening. Please go check out Gecko Labs as well as Urban Ark Conservation. I hope that conversation sort of changes your mind in terms of how we can approach the idea of conservation. I know many of us kind of get stuck in that assumption that as long as we're breeding and keeping animals at home, that is part of conservation. And although that does play a small role, introducing people to animals at a young age can help conservation in sort of a downstream effect, where you introduce a kid to an animal and then maybe later on in a few years he starts acting as an ambassador for conservation or something like that. But I do think Dillon really does hit the nail on the head. We do need to financially support the organizations that are out there doing the dirty work and protecting the species with boots on the ground. Unless you are a giant producer and you're actually offsetting that wild-caught trade, then you really can't be doing too much in terms of alleviating the need for wild-caught animals in the market. Unless you happen to be working with a species that is very rare in the reptile trade, maybe only 10 or 12 other people actually keep that particular animal and you're learning what conditions it needs to thrive and how to make it breed and whatnot. That's maybe a slightly different scenario, but for the most part, keeping animals in captivity can only do so much for the wild populations, and really the organizations out there are the things we need to be supporting. Anyway, thank you very much for tuning in for another week. I do really appreciate you guys every single week tuning into the podcast. The podcast numbers are growing. I have some super exciting announcements that are coming hopefully in the next few weeks that I'm really looking forward to sharing with you guys. And so make sure you stick around and stay for that. If you're not subscribed to the podcast on either iTunes or Spotify, make sure you go do that. And check out animalsathome.ca/shop if you want to pick yourself up a t-shirt or a sweater. Right now, printing is kind of behind by the company that I use to print the shirts because of COVID. But if you do order a shirt, it will eventually get there. And of course, $5 is donated right to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy. Thank you very much to CustomReptileHabitats.com for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. Definitely go check them out. There are links in the show notes as well as the YouTube description. I will catch you guys next week.